Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Institute for Australian and Chinese Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University. I'm Professor Jing Han, the director of the Institute. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that we are on Parramatta South Campus, which is on the country of the Darug people of the Darug Nation, and acknowledge their ancestors who have been the traditional owners of their country for thousands of years. We also want to pay our respect to the First Nations elders of the countries we are all sitting on today, past, present, and emerging. The aim of my China story series is to widen and deepen the understanding of humanized and multifaceted China through sharing lived experiences and the knowledge of China by Australian public figures. For today's episode, we are greatly honored to have a distinguished Australian cultural historian, Emeritus Professor David Walker, AM. Professor Walker's My China story is quite unique in several ways. Firstly, Professor Walker, as a historian and a leading authority in the study of Australian perceptions of Asia, has played a pivotal role in moving Asia into the mainstream Australian historical writing. His books inform our understanding of Chinese migrants and China through Australia's responses to Chinese migrants and to China in history. Secondly, Professor Walker has been a long-standing expert in Australian studies and served as the inaugural chair of Australian studies in China, which provided him with a unique position to see and to contribute to the connection of the two countries through Australian studies. Lastly, in 2022, Professor Walker and Professor Li Yao published the first parallel memoir of an Australian and a Chinese. So we really look forward to hearing Professor Walker's stories. Professor Walker will firstly give a presentation, followed by my conversation with Professor Walker. After that, audiences can ask questions. The way you do that is to post your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. At the end of our conversation, I will collect your questions for Professor Walker to respond. Now, please welcome Professor David Walker, AM, to give his presentation.
Thank you very much for your introduction, Jing. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I also wish to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the land of the Kulin Nation in Victoria. My first visit to China was in 1993. So happily, this is almost the 30th anniversary of my first trip, which was to Yangzhou Normal University, and in Jiangsu province. And I'd just been appointed to the chair of Australian Studies at Deakin University, which had a connection to Yangzhou, developing Australian Studies teaching, the resources of the Australian Studies Centre, and so on. So I was there to foster that connection. On the day that I arrived, the whole of the university seemed to be ballroom dancing, and that was a kind of reminder of a different era. And I think they felt that Fred Astaire, the great ballroom dancer of stage and screen from the 1940s and 1950s, had arrived in the form of the visiting professor. But I caused an enormous disappointment, I think, because my foxtrot was just not up to scratch at all. But I visited Yangzhou on a number of occasions through the 1990s. And as I say, we built up a strong connection to that university. In 2004, there was a change of direction and a change of focus when I was invited to give a lecture at Renmin University by the formidable Professor Zhang, who was then director of the Australian Studies Centre there. I remember it being an absolutely dreadful day. It was just before Christmas, December 2004. It was wet, cold, and absolutely miserable. And I wondered what on earth I was doing. But I got to Renmin, and soon realised that I was there for a serious purpose. There was one of those banners that was about 50 metres wide and 10 metres high, which read, Renmin University welcomes Professor David Walker. And I thought, well, that's pretty good. I rather like that. And then the audience was terrific, a great body of students, some terrific questions. And I forgot the weather, and indeed forgot it even more comprehensively when Professor Zhang invited Karen and I and our daughter Veronica, who was also in Beijing then, to dine at the Bai Family Restaurant, #1 Suzhou Street, near Peking University, a traditional courtyard house. And by that stage in the early evening, a light snow was falling, so it was wonderfully atmospheric. And after about the 15th course, Professor Zhang asked if I would like to become a visiting professor at Renmin University, and I very readily agreed. So for the next 7 or 8 years, I made annual visits to Renmin University, which had a strong Australian studies program. And one of the really rewarding things about it was the contact with the students doing their MA at Renmin. And my role was to help them select research topics, to help them locate sources and resources, and to help them with questions around methodology and approach. And that was terrific, really. And Professor Zhang was also very keen to have his students be prepared for performances of this kind, Zoom type presentations, PPT presentations, and so on. So the students were very thoroughly groomed, both in terms of their presentation skills, but also in the content of their research theses. So I enjoyed those visits very, very much, got to know Beijing in the course of that time. So when in 2012, the Foundation for Australian Studies in China advertised the inaugural BHP Chair of Australian Studies at Peking University, I wondered if I should apply, and did so, was interviewed and got the job. So from 2013 to 2016, I was in that position, and that was an enormously rewarding time to be in Beijing. It was when we got to know Li Yao, and was one of the high points of in my life, and I'm sure Karen's as well. We visited a lot of places in China and thoroughly enjoyed our time there. But I understand that you have a number of questions, Jing, so I might stop there and have you answer your question. Have you ask your questions, and I will endeavour to answer them.
Excellent. I mean, I'm sure audiences can tell that David is such a good storyteller, and just like a historian. Sometimes you feel like a historian, they can be dry, but not David. David Walker is the best storyteller. I always enjoy listening to him talking and his stories. So today we are very lucky to have him, and I have prepared quite a few questions. And now I will ask David, you mentioned a few books that you have written. I have to say I enjoyed reading and rereading all of your books. Let's start with your being a historian. So you are highly regarded Australian historian. Your knowledge of Chinese policy, Chinese people and history includes your studies and writing on early Chinese migrants in Australia during the gold rush in the 1850s. In your book, Anxious Nation, Australia and the Rise of Asia, 1850 to 1939. Yes, this book. You wrote about those early gold miners from China under the chapter heading 100 Work as One, as quoted from James Hinston's book, The Australia Abroad. the influx and the presence of Chinese workers in the gold fields and their powers of working together in a highly disciplined way caused serious concerns and led to racial discriminations. But their successes, due to being incredibly adaptable and hard work, were also acknowledged by some. And as you know, this sense of unity and collective mindset very much exists in modern China. So my question is, do you see this collective consciousness as a Chinese characteristic and as a part of the culture? And what is your view on Chinese collectivism?
Thank you for the question, Jing. Yes, the phrase 100 workers won intrigued me when I came upon it, because I think it went to a number of assumptions about the Chinese from a Western or Australian perspective. One of those assumptions was, in a sense, it was a tribute to the Chinese capacity for coordinated labour. And one of the other dimensions of that tribute was the implied criticism of a kind of unruly individualism among the diggers of European background. So there was a sense in which the Chinese could do things in a very cohesive way that escaped Europeans. But on the other hand, it was also a criticism because it suggested that there was no individuality in the Chinese. They had no capacity for initiative. And so some of those other metaphors which come up in the Orientalist discourse around ant heaps and beehives also play into that notion that the Chinese are not capable of individual thinking, individual decision-making, and initiative. So it cut both ways, the 100 workers won. Of course, the other dimension of the concern was that it emerged as a considerable threat in a way, because you had the prospect of 400 million Chinese, which is the number around 1900. If you get 400 million Chinese all working as one, that's a bit of a problem facing 4 million unruly, undisciplined Europeans in Australia. So again, sitting behind that idea is a deeper concern about the capacity of a society like Australia was at the turn of the century to withstand the kind of challenge that a seriously disciplined, cohesive China might present. And I think one of the remarkable things about some of this language is how the echoes of the past resonate so loudly in the present, because so much of what we hear now echoes some of those sentiments. Now, it's also clear, I think, that China does have a much more cohesive political system. There are other words, of course, but let's call it cohesive. And that does present a particular sort of threat to Australia, which still sees itself, I think, as both individualistic and, to a degree, difficult to manage. We're difficult to steer. So those tropes continue to play out, I think, in the discussion of the Australia-China relationship. But again, they're very old ones. A lot of that goes back to the late 19th century. And one of the things as a historian I notice and comment upon is the repeated nature of some of these stereotypes and the difficulty we have of actually breaking beyond them, moving beyond them.
Well, it's really good answer, especially so good to hear from a historian and a historical perspective. It's really make a difference. And also I really like your phrase, it cuts both ways. And there are so many things that it cuts both ways, and especially when it applies to China. So it's quite interesting. My next question is around your second book, stranded nation, white Australia in an Asian region. There is a chapter about Australia's responses to the new Red China, The Road to Paris, which examines the historical past from the 1950s to 1972 that saw the establishment of the diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. So from the 1950s, people like C.P. Fitzgerald, one of the greatest authorities on Chinese affairs, urged that Australia not only needed to recognize the new China, but to understand it. And up to the beginning of the 1970s, with people like Walter Crocker, deploring how little Australians knew about China and how far foreign policy had been driven by fear. Reading this book, as you have just mentioned, I couldn't help feeling that history repeats itself, especially given that China today is in many ways a new China to Australia and to the world compared to what China was 20 years ago. So my question is, as a historian, can you share with us your views on what we should learn from history and how we should learn from history?
Yes. Give me several days and I'll answer your question. I'll go to the phrase first, the road to Paris, which I think Lenin's phrase in 1918. And his contention was that the way communism would spread into Europe would be from the Soviet Union into China, and then onto Europe, and Australia would of course be cleaned up along the way. So we were collateral damage in this move towards world domination. And the road to Paris was a phrase often used and invoked through the 1950s and 1960s. Many people were aware of it. And I think it spoke to a dual narrative, if you like. One was that this idea, and it goes back in some ways to 100 Workers One, that whatever the Chinese decided upon, they were going to deliver it. So if the word was out that China was determined to follow the dictates of the 1918 statement by Lenin, then sure as eggs that would happen. That's how things would eventuate. So it goes to that idea of a kind of relentless, remorseless, and truly menacing focus of attention. Nothing could have China deviate from the course that history had set it in that particular way. But going through the literature of the period, there was another counter-narrative, if you like, which was that China was so muddled and disorganized, so incapable of getting its act together, that it was unlikely to ever present any kind of threat to the Western world. So you have two fundamentally opposed understandings of what China was at a time when it was really important for Australia to get a sense of what the new China was about. And again, that I think goes to questions of expertise. I mean, who was advising people on the new China and who was listening? You raised C.P. Fitzgerald, who was a considerable authority on China, and his book, The Birth of Communist China, was published in 1951 or 52, one of the earliest texts on the new China. But C.P. Fitzgerald was under considerable suspicion as a kind of leftist who was unreliable. So whether or not, and he had an immense ASIO file, incidentally. I mean, every movement that C.P. Fitzgerald made in the 50s and 60s, including when he ate toast for breakfast or a boiled egg, was recorded by ASIO. It's a marvelous record of his activities. but it also speaks to the idea that he was simply an unreliable witness, that you don't listen to him. So I think there's a real question in our culture about widening the range of opinion that we are prepared to listen to at the policy and the government level, because you don't actually know necessarily who's got the right answers and who's picking the trends accurately or not. Now, Walter Crocker is also a very interesting figure, because he was in a sense, the leading diplomat of the 1950s and 60s. He was very close to the Menzies government, so he was a conservative figure. But Crocker, I was surprised to discover, wanted to become Australia's first ambassador to the People's Republic of China. And as we all know, we were very lucky to have Dr. Stephen Fitzgerald play that role. But I found it really interesting that Crocker wanted that job, and it was actually trying to persuade the Conservative government that we needed much more intelligence, much deeper knowledge, much more awareness of China than we were getting through the normal channels, whatever the normal channels were. So I guess one of the answers to your question is that the flow of information about China, I think, came through a very narrow aperture. You know, that there wasn't a broad stream of opinion, and you do wonder at the level of policy what government was hearing. And one of the other texts in this story is Clark. What's his name? Clark, but In Fear of China, published, early 60s. And again, his argument is that in a sense, government was paralysed by a fear of China, which in a sense meant that it couldn't analyse as objectively and as clearly as possible just what the options were. It couldn't stand back and do the kind of calm, measured, thoughtful and wide-ranging analysis that this new China represented. So I think the other point I'll make very quickly here is that going back to that old fear of China, which was one of the stories of Anxious Nation, that did, I think, have a paralysing effect in a way that you couldn't easily escape that paradigm, that idea that China was a threat. And the Chinese economy in 1950s and 60s was pretty weak. So other kinds of threat had to be found, and they were found. So when the Chinese economy improves dramatically after the Cultural Revolution and into the 1990s and after, then some of the old threats are warehoused, and the new threats, which become economic threats and so on, and more recently military threats, move to the front of the queue. So that's a kind of answer to your question, I think.
Oh, excellent, so good. It's so enlightening to listen to what you say, because you provide us so many this historical context. It's really make a lot of sense when we look at what's happening today. My next question coming to your lived experiences in China. So as you mentioned, you made your first trip in China in 1993 to Yangzhou University. Yangzhou is a medium-sized, very beautiful city in Jiangsu province, as you mentioned, known for its gardens, Islamic relics, ancient temples, and there is also slender West Lake, Shouxihu. I've actually never had a good luck to go there, to be in that city at all. But as you know, China is a vast and a varied, especially after later on you've been traveled to so many other cities in China. So can you tell us some of the most striking differences that you see between Yangzhou in the south and Inner Mongolia in the north?
Yes, Yangzhou, I have to say that there was a gap, probably a gap of almost 15 years from about 2000, when I last went to Yangzhou, and about 2015 when I went back again. And it's an absolute cliche of Chinese commentary, how dramatically China changes. But Yangzhou is virtually unrecognizable. You know, the small, medium-sized city that you described had absolutely disappeared. You know, it wasn't on the rail line in 1993. In 2015, you know, there's a huge railway station there, slender West Lake, which was a wonderful and beautiful, tranquil place in the 1990s, seemed to have been swallowed by buildings and crowds and so on. So it was literally almost unrecognizable, but that's a common experience across China, and it's something that Chinese people also reflect upon, that they're often living in cities that are unrecognizable from their childhood, which is not an experience we know in the West. We did spend a lot of time in going north to Inner Mongolia, and I think we can attribute that to Professor Li Yao, who always seemed to be pointing us north. He had a deep suspicion, of course, of Southerners. They weren't entirely reliable, so he was just saving us from their perfidious behaviour. But of course, one of the differences is landscape. You know, the vast grasslands of Inner Mongolia, which we were enormously attracted to, I have to say, and those big horizons were also in some ways reminiscent of parts of Australia. So that, which is not a good reason necessarily for liking a place or whatever, but you respond. You do respond to that kind of thing. And so those landscapes, those big horizons, were very, very powerful places, experiences, and indeed reminded me somewhat of the mid-north of South Australia, which is also huge landscapes, big horizons, often very empty spaces. Now, you don't get a strong sense of empty space in Yangzhou or in Jiangsu province. So that the idea of a crowded China was very much the experience of the South, and the idea of a vast Inner Mongolian landscape opening out onto the Soviet Union and so on. There's just so much to the north of Beijing. And I think often Australians, when they think of China, think of southern China. They think, Hong Kong, Shanghai, and then they might, if they're extremely audacious, get as far as Beijing. But then exhaustion overtakes us at that point, I think, and we can't imagine that there's much of China beyond Beijing. But I'm here to say there's quite a lot. So that was also a discovery, just what that huge territory beyond and to the north of Beijing is, and what it means in a geopolitical sense. It's a vast expanse of territory with immense wealth, and again opening on to the Soviet Union. So of course there are all sorts of other culinary differences as well around diet and so on, and each of the provinces, as I came to understand in China, has its special attributes. So you're in one place and they have the best apricots in China, and somewhere else has the best rice and so on. So each of the provinces have their own local patriotism, if you like, about the special attributes of their people and their place.
Well, you said it all. Gosh, yes. The rivalries between North and the South, and the differences from, between each province, and yes, a little patriotism in each place, local places. It's really interesting to hear this from you. And thanks to Li Yao, who brought you to Inner Mongolia, and the interesting comparison of Inner Mongolia or vastness with Australia. Yeah, that's really interesting. then the move to the next phase of your life. It's amazing what you've been doing in all these things. You were appointed, as you mentioned, the first BHP chair of Australian Studies in China in 2012, and based in Peking University. And prior to that, you have been the professor of Australian Studies in Australia at Deakin University, and all up for over 25 years. So I'm very curious to know your views and thoughts on Australian studies in China, because I started my Australian studies in China before I came to Australia in early 1988. So first the question is, what were the things that impressed you the most regarding Australian studies in China during your time as the inaugural chair?
Well, a number of things impressed me. And of course, one of the things that impresses me too is the education you must have received, Jing, in order to be so knowledgeable about Australia before you arrived. So we should put that on the record. But I mean, again, there's the size question. I mean, as someone very wisely said, we do China by numbers. And you know, there are 37, 38, 39 Australian Studies centres across China. There are more Australian Studies centres in China than in the rest of the world combined, and so on and so on. So there are a large number of centres, and that in itself was impressive. And one of the pleasant responsibilities of the chair was to visit as many of those centres as possible. And Karen and I would have got to see at least 25 of them across the time we were there, and a number of them more than once. So in a sense, the diversity of settings was impressive. The range of interests was also interesting, because those programs, as you know, really began with literature and linguistics. And that's the Gang of Nine, going back to the Gang of Nine in 1979, who went to Sydney University. They were, broadly speaking, people with a literature, linguistics set of interests. They are the people who established the first Australian Studies centres, including at Peking University. But by 2013, there was a growing diversity in that community. So the literature and linguistics dimension was still there, and still there quite strongly. But there was a growing interest in economic relations between Australia and China, a growing interest in politics and the political culture of Australia, international relations. Environmental studies was also emerging as a particular interest. So the range of programs and the range of interests, I think, was becoming quite notable. I think the other thing that was clear in a way was that as much as the Australian side, through the Foundation for Australian Studies in China, Australian China Council, when it was in existence and so on, offered support to the centres. These centres were really sustained by the universities in which they were located, because they saw the need to establish international connections. And so from an Australian point of view, I think it was really very rewarding to see that a number of Chinese universities saw that a connection to Australia was an important part of their international profile and of their building connections to the wider world. And I think if we were to compare Australian studies, for example, with Canadian studies, and I'm rather hoping no Canadians are in the audience, but Australian studies was rather stronger, was quite a lot stronger, I think, than Canadian studies. And you could argue that we're roughly comparable or comparable in that way. So I think from the Australian side, it's also really important that we have Chinese people, students and staff, developing a fuller understanding of Australia. So it really matters a great deal to us. But it was rewarding to see that on the Chinese side, there was both an interest in Australia and a recognition that a knowledge of Australia was important to China as well, and in all sorts of ways beyond the economic relationship, which is, of course, a significant one.
Well, it's so good. And I'm sure those people in Australian Studies Centres in China, they must be very pleased to hear all this recognition. It is amazing. And when you see all this, and it's also interesting to hear the mention of a comparison of Canadian studies in China. It's true, it's much less than Australian studies. My next question about your time in China as the chair of Australian studies is, can you tell us how Australian studies in Australia is different from Australian studies in China?
Yes, I can. Australian studies in Australia really began in the 1970s. It kind of came out of the Whitlam era, and it was a recognition that Australia and Australian students needed a greater degree of cultural literacy, if you like, and there was a feeling that they weren't getting that. So Australian studies was introduced as an interdisciplinary examination of Australia across politics, culture, international relations, other disciplines. So, and it had a fresh face and a jaunty posture at that time. But increasingly, I think Australian universities began teaching Australian content across a range of disciplines. So in politics courses, in sociology courses, in literature courses, the Australian content became more and more apparent through the 1970s, 80s and 90s. So the particular rationale for standalone Australian studies courses began to diminish. So from the early 2000s, Australian studies in Australia began to lose its hold, if you like, as the study of Australia diversified and increased. So it became increasingly, I think, an export item. It made sense to group all of the studies of Australia under the banner of Australian studies when you were in an international environment, including in the European environment. So we talk about Australian studies in Europe, the European Australian Studies Association and so on. So Australian studies was the kind of umbrella term for an export item which covered all aspects of Australian society. There are differences, again, I think, in the way different countries in the region approach Australian studies. Like in Japan, there's rather less emphasis on Australian studies per se than on Pacific studies. So there's a language of Pacific orientation, Pacific studies in Japan, which tends to link Australia to other Pacific nations. Whereas I think in China, there's still a sense that Australia is a unique and discrete nation with its own political culture, its own environments, and its own language. Professor Zhang, for example, was a great enthusiast for Australian English, and was a very fine exponent of Australian English, some of which can be repeated in public, some of which can't. So I think the different settings, different formulations of the Australian Studies project developed. So at Peking University, for example, I did a lot of teaching of undergraduate students, which was fantastic. I mean, the students were terrific. I gave my only ever essay result of full marks to a Peking University student, because it seemed to me absolutely impossible to realistically imagine a better answer to a difficult, idiosyncratic and complex question than the one I received. And that was before AI. So AI couldn't have done it. And it couldn't have been poached from the internet. So the students were terrific and very rewarding. And they were they were interested in Australia, but they also had some attitudes towards Australia which were in some ways deeply embedded and hard to shake. Like they, by and large, had the view that Australia was a pristine environment, untouched by the foot of mankind, you know. And occasionally we had to talk to them about the Great Barrier Reef or environmental damage or environmental hazards. But the idea of Australia as pristine, as blue skies, lovely beaches, golden sands, was rather hard to remove. And of course, the Australian tourism industry would not want that to be removed. So I was not acting at their behest in this educational mission. But there was some quite interesting and as I say, deeply embedded understandings of Australia, some of which were accurate and some of which were not.
Well, it's such a joy to listen to your views, and because you are on both sides. So, and I've learned something new. My next question, also in relation to this, is do you think Australian studies in China have played a significant role in helping China know about Australia? And also, in your view, does China has sufficient Australian knowledge and capability?
That's a pretty tough question to answer in a way, because you can't quite know what the influence might be. But I think it's, I go back to what I said before, and even without knowing what the influence is, I mean, it's really important that we have people with a familiarity with Australia who kind of have a warm response to Australia, if you like, and who are interested in Australia. So I think from an Australian point of view, that really matters, and it's important that we continue to present ourselves in the Chinese environment, something seriously disrupted by the pandemic, actually. But if we can get back to face-to-face presentations, people-to-people contacts, because I think when other things are going wrong, and clearly other things have gone wrong, it's really important for people in the university sector, for educators, as most of us are in this environment, to speak our truths to each other, you know, that we really need to make those contacts, to continue those contacts, and to build upon them. Of course, the other dimension to that is that you have, in a figure like Li Yao, someone who's translated over 40 Australian books into Chinese, Australian writing into Chinese. Now, again, it's very hard to measure the impact of that, but it's hard to also imagine that there's no impact. Clearly, this is building a readership for Australia, a better understanding of Australia, and an interest in Australia that is particularly important to us. On the Chinese side, I think there are a number of people that we encountered during the time in China who were very knowledgeable about Australia, who loved Australia, visited Australia often. But I think one of the real difficulties that many had was understanding the particular nuances of our political system and also the way the media worked. And one of the things that often, or one of the discussions that often arose, was around there'd be some reporting of an issue or an opinion in China. I remember particularly a Pauline Hanson episode in which she frothed at the mouth about something or other. And there was quite a deal of concern about that in the group that I was talking to in Beijing. And I tried to point out that, okay, she's a significant figure in the Australian political system. She's a senator. She has a role to play. but she's not the only voice, and she's not the dominant voice. She has a capacity for gaining media attention, but the fact is that there are a diversity of opinions, and we can't necessarily take one out of context and elevate that to being what Australians think about China or race or whatever the topic happened to be. So I think there was more on our side to do about the way the media works in Australia, about the independence of the media, and the way certain political figures can have an outsized, loud-speaking profile in the Australian environment that just simply wouldn't happen in China. So it's a hard media and political environment to understand. But I think, you know, we need to do a bit more work on that one, because that really does matter, I think.
What amazes me when I listening to your answers, because you always give this very balanced answer. You cover all aspects, you know, all grounds. Must have a lot to do with your being a historian. So it's quite interesting. In 2011, you published your memoir, Not Dark Yet, A Personal History. The book I love reading and rereading. It's one of the best. And the novelist Jeanette Turner Hospital actually commented that like the best memoirs, like all the best memoirs, your account has the narrative curve of a novel, and it's a sweep, brings back to life an era in all its domestic, cultural, and political detail. So I really can't agree with her more. My question is, out of curiosity as well, would being a historian make it easier or actually more challenging in writing your own family history? Did it give you more freedom because others couldn't question whatever you said about your own family?
Yes, I think it did. I think it did give more freedom, Jing. I also affirm your proposition that I am an extremely balanced person, of course, but I think it did give me more freedom. I mean, it happened. The book arose because as you know, in 2004, I became legally blind, and that made writing the kind of archivally intense history that Anxious Nation was, and up to a point, a Stranded Nation, of course, which I completed later. It made those projects rather more difficult, and I thought at that time that kind of work had disappeared, that my life as an historian doing that kind of work had gone. And so I turned to another kind of archive, which I refer to as the archive between the ears, which is all the memories and impressions we have of family, of parents, of how they spoke, of the language they used, of their manners, how they dressed, how they conducted themselves. And there was a kind of compact social history built into those ordinary memories, if you like. These are ordinary. My parents and wider family were ordinary people. The most elevated status we ever achieved was one of my forebears became mayor of Burra in South Australia, and I'd like a little polite applause if you don't mind for. So we're in Chinese terms, we're small potatoes. We're small potatoes, but the social history of the small potato is, I think, a pretty important kind of history to write. There were no diaries from these people. They wrote. There was one letter I found that my father wrote just before I was born, which sadly only talked about flowers and planting flowers, gladioli, and made no mention of my imminent arrival. So I was keenly disappointed by this awful document. But as a historian, I thought that one of the things that had surprised me about some of the memoirs from historians, and of course I won't name names, was that they were rather throwaway efforts at the end of a serious career as a historian. So I thought, hang on, what's going on here? These people are deeply trained in the disciplines of history, and yet when they come to write their own story, they somehow throw that away, and it becomes rather more flimsy and off the cuff and rather less impressive. So what I wanted to do is actually bring some of the research skills that historians allegedly have to the task of writing one's own family history. And that proved to be a very rewarding and worthwhile exercise. On the question of freedom, I mean, it did give me quite a bit of freedom in a way, because as anyone working in a university will know, we always have to justify what we're researching. So to say to my dean that I was writing a book about my mum just didn't cut it. But if I was able to repackage it as something rather more profound than that, which I assiduously did, I can assure you, I could get away with it. Besides, it was very difficult to criticize someone who was legally blind for doing anything. So I think I got away with murder on a lot of those things, because it didn't meet any of the stern criteria that my dean of that time imposed upon their academic staff. You know, I was up to no good, but I enjoyed it. I thought it was an extremely worthwhile exercise. One of my colleagues, I might point out, I was astonished to hear this, asked me a sociologist, asked me what damage I thought writing such a book had done to my reputation. Well, I was astonished by this in two ways. First, that I had a reputation to damage, and secondly, that she should ask the question. I mean, I was just amazed that she should think that a book like this, which was a departure from mainstream academic writing, could be regarded as some sort of detriment or backward step or failing of some kind. I was pretty amazed by that. But no, it was a rewarding exercise, and of course, I was very pleased when Li Yao agreed to translate it, which he did.
Oh, I'm glad I asked this question, because I didn't anticipate, so much, so interesting stories that you actually brought up. It's fascinating. And again, as you can tell, Professor David Walker has an enormous sense of humor. It's I always found delightful, and it's so interesting talking to him. And you can tell it's just amazing the way that he tells the story. Yes, you mentioned the Not Dark Yet actually led you to know very well Professor Li Yao, who translated the book. And you also mentioned Li Yao translated over 40 books of Australian writing. And then you too wrote and published this dual memoir, Happy Together, Bridging the Australian-China Divide, which is also the first, parallel memoir by an Australian and Chinese. So I also have a couple of questions on this book. Again, I want to ask this writing process, because I found it quite curious. How did this writing process work? Did you two write separately and then put the stories together, or did you discuss each section first and found the links across each other's story, then went back to write?
Yes, well, I'll begin with a remarkable observation, Jing, that we two were three, because of course Karen was involved in that process as well, and particularly so, of course, in a lot of our travelling, which took us into Inner Mongolia quite often. Now, the thing emerged because, having translated Not Dark Yet, Li Yao said that he would like a book like that about his own family. So we kind of discussed how that might happen, and it was his view that it would be best, or he would like to do it as a collaboration. That he would tell his story to us, and that we would also visit the sites that mattered to him and his family, mainly in Shanxi province and also in Inner Mongolia. that's pretty much what we decided to do. So there was a lot of wonderful travelling on fast trains, and sometimes on much slower trains into Inner Mongolia at that stage, visiting often small communities, including, for example, Lee Village, which I don't think had ever seen a foreigner. And indeed, everyone seemed to be indoors. So even then, I don't think they saw us. But it was a very small little village where Li Yao was born. So we went to many, many places that tourists would just never get to see, that foreigners would never get to see. So we took a lot of time on the travelling. We took a lot of time discussing our parallel lives, and Li Yao was quite insistent that it should be a dual memoir. You'll be astonished to hear, Jing, that I wanted my part of the story to be rather less than it turned out to be. But Li Yao insisted that I had to be there in the form that I was there. So we can blame him for that. We did lay out a draft chapter outline, which, as so often happens in draft chapter outlines, bears very little resemblance to the final text. What Li Yao presented us with was an outline of his life, with key moments in that life in English. And Li Yao is the first to admit that his written English is not his greatest strength. So, but it was a perfectly intelligible outline of the key elements in his own life. Now, Karen also then got that text and straightened out the grammar and expression and so on where it needed to be. And we sent that back to Li Yao and said, well, what do you think about that? And so Li Yao would come back to us. So there's a lot of backwards and forwards on this. And then I turned that draft into the kind of language that appears in the final text. But throughout the process, drafts were going backwards and forwards. We'd ask Li Yao for clarification about, you said this, what did you mean? Why was it so important for you to go to this place at that time? And what did you mean? And so on. So there was a lot of that, a lot of discussion backwards and forwards around what each of us might have meant by certain statements, or why was this location important and not that one. One of the really rewarding things about the exercise too was that this business of finding the home of the Li family in Shanxi province. And being a literary gentleman, of course, Li Yao thought that that it was impossible to discover this. You know, literary people don't take research at all seriously. I rebuked him firmly about this and said, look, there's got to be something. There's got to be some record, something. We can find something. And he said, no, this is not Australia. This is China. You can't find anything. And I said, well, that's not right. So we resolved to try and find the home village that the family had come from in its voyage from Shanxi province to Inner Mongolia in the late 19th century. And we went to various places, Taiyuan and other places, tracking down records, and eventually we were taken to Li San Chuan, which is a pronunciation you'll have to correct, Jing, which was the family village, the village from which Li Yao's family had come in the 1890s. And that was a tremendously powerful, emotionally powerful experience for us all. I mean, it was great for us that we had bullied Li Yao into finding out where it was, and it was great for Li Yao to meet people who were, in a sense, members of his own family. The Li the Lee name represented about 85% of Lee Village. So that was, that was an enormously rewarding experience. So throughout the writing process, I think each of us felt that we were learning so much about the other, and the writing process continually sharpened and shaped that set of responses. And it also, towards the end of the book, we go into some of the questions which I consider pretty important in these discussions around Sinophobia and related understandings of how Australia has understood China. So the book also looks back to other travellers like Mary Gaunt, who travelled through China in 2013 and so on. So it traces a set of connections to China, but it brings it into the modern era, through the Cultural Revolution, into the modern era, and into our convergent lives, if you like, the point at which Li Yao began to move as a translator towards Australia, and the point at which, as an Australian studies person, I began to gravitate towards Asia and China. So there is a kind of arc of convergence there that brought us together. But we also love him dearly. He's a lovely man. And of course, he's listening.
Yes, he's in the audience. Just so we can't see him. Thank you so much, Professor David Walker, for sharing, your words of wisdom. And it's such a pleasure to hear your very enlightening, very insightful, and very interesting responses to all the questions and your presentation. So thank you so much. And it is a great session, I have to say. And also, I would like to thank all the audiences to this session. And thank you so much. And we'll see you next time. Thank you, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Jean.